Hello, and welcome to the launch of the IEA's Renewables 2022 Market Report. I'm Jethro Mullen, Editor-in-Chief in the IEA's Communications team, and I'm joined today by IEA Executive Director Dr. Fatih Birol and the lead author of the Renewables Report, Hamy Bahar. Dr. Birol will make some opening remarks, and then Mr. Bahar will present the key findings of the report, and then we'll then have time to take some questions from journalists. At the start of this press webinar, I'd like to remind everyone that the report is freely available on our website along with an in-depth data explorer. So do please take a look when you have the chance. For the journalists taking part in this press webinar, we invite you to submit your questions via the Q&A function in the Zoom. You can do this at any point during the presentation, and we'll also take a 2-minute break right after the presentation for you to submit your questions. And with that, I'll hand over to our Executive Director, Dr. Birol.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mullen, and greetings to all the friends, colleagues who are following this webinar from the International Energy Agency headquarters in Paris. Dear colleagues, dear friends, as we have said, just after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, we are in the middle of the first global energy crisis. Our world has never ever witnessed an energy crisis of this depth and of this complexity. So therefore, it is very important for governments, for businesses, for scientists, economists, and the others to be able to read the facts at the right time and position themselves in the right way in the middle of this crisis. It is very important, we believe, to distinguish facts from fiction. And as such, we, as the International Energy Agency, we ask ourselves, is this global energy crisis, is it going to slow down or accelerate clean energy transitions? And our answer is definitely we see an acceleration, a strong acceleration of clean energy transitions. Only last week, we have released a report on heat pumps, an important technology, to look at the heat pump evolution around the world, in Asia, in Europe, in North America, and elsewhere. And our numbers, our analysis highlighted a huge surge in heat pump installation across the world. Again, last week, we look at the energy efficiency improvements around the world in our energy efficiency annual report. And after many years of a slow progress, our energy efficiency report highlighted this year a strong improvement in energy efficiency and a major acceleration of energy efficiency investments. And today, we are with you in order to share the findings of our annual Renewable Energy Market 2022. And the findings of this renewable report is not different than the other ones. We are seeing a huge, as some of the newspapers call today, boom in renewable energies around the world. In the last 20 years, we have been already seeing a rapid expansion of renewables. But now, when you look at our numbers, even in the current policy setting, in the next 5 years, the growth will be equal to what we have seen in the last 20 years. In the next 5 years, ladies and gentlemen, the world will add a renewable capacity as much as it did in the last 2 decades, or if you want to have another, put in another context, we will put renewable capacity in place in the next 5 years equal to the current power capacity of China. So huge growth. Why it is happening? A big growth for renewables. In addition to the, of course, climate commitments that the many countries have been pushing as a key driver of renewables, we are seeing two new elements, at least two new elements which are turbocharging the renewables growth. The first one is energy security. Many countries around the world see renewables now an option to address the energy security concerns. It is very obvious, for example, in Europe. Many countries in Europe, we are seeing huge growth in renewables in Europe, and this is, among other reasons, this is driven by replacing Russian gas imports, at least partly, by renewables. So energy security is a driver. Another driver is the, we all know that the cost of renewables came down recently significantly in the last few years, but the high and volatile fossil fuel prices, gas, coal, makes renewables competitive, even more competitive when it comes to electricity generation, and high oil prices make biofuels in transportation sector even more attractive. So these are some of the reasons, together with the environmental benefits of renewables, giving an even stronger push to renewables, especially solar, wind, but also hydropower, geothermal, and biofuels when it comes to transportation sector. I am sure my colleague, Mr. Bahar, who is in charge of this report, will tell you some of the numbers. Again, renewables are breaking records after records, but I wanted to share one of them with you, which I found very impressive. In the year 2027, in 5 years of time, the latest solar, I am not saying renewables altogether, only solar will be the number one source of electricity in the world. So solar is and will be the king of global power markets. So this is very impressive. It is driven by solar installations in India, China, Europe, United States, and elsewhere. And to see such a big growth of solar is, of course, very good news for many reasons, from energy security to economic benefits, from economic benefits to environmental benefits. Another important finding of the study is on the manufacturing side. We all know, and our numbers show, that China, after years and years investing in the solar manufacturing, as of today, covers about 90% of the global solar manufacturing capacity at home. But as a result of the efforts and the new investment programs coming from United States in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, and also from India, we are seeing that this and other countries, this 90% will go down about 75%, even a bit less, in 2027. So we are seeing a diversification of solar manufacturing in the world. Still, of course, China will have the lion share. Perhaps I would highlight two more findings of the study, and I will leave it to my colleague, Mr. Bahar, to continue. The hydrogen, the renewable based hydrogen, we are seeing 100-fold increase between now and 2027. And our numbers show that the hydrogen the renewable use for hydrogen may reach around 50 gigawatts by 2027. A very promising start for clean hydrogen, and as such we think it is something to underline as well. Now, dear colleagues, my last finding I want to share with you is the following. The numbers, in my view, very impressive growth of renewables, these numbers I share with you, are in the context of the current policy setting. And it may well be the case that the governments understand the merits of pushing renewables even stronger in terms of its energy security, economic and environmental benefits, pushing some additional policy buttons ranging from cutting the red tape in the context of permitting and licensing to the providing financial incentives to renewables and providing more certainty in the markets. These numbers may be even higher. So as such, we have a so-called accelerated case if the governments would push the renewables a bit stronger, and you will see that the numbers could go much higher, even higher than I have just highlighted to you. So I would like to finish by thanking all the governments, experts from governments we have consulted throughout this project, many industry experts, the engineering companies. I think Mr. Bahar and his team look at project by project, the renewable projects around the world, and thousands of projects, and came up with these numbers. And I would like to also thank him and his team for this excellent work. Once again, highlighting the great acceleration of clean energy around the world, and confirming what we have said some time ago: a new global energy economy is emerging. And the findings of this report is a very important proof of this. Thank you very much. Now I would like to turn to my colleague, Mr. Bahar, to share some of the findings of this report.
Thank you very much, Dr. Birol. I'd like to share several key findings of the report with you today. I'd like to start with the past. Over the past 20 years, renewables have been growing significantly thanks to the very important policy support that has been provided in more than 100 countries in the world. Now we are seeing a growth in the next 5 years, which is about 2,400 gigawatts, which will be basically much faster than last 20 years. We will achieve it in just 5 years. And this growth is basically driven by different kind of motivations. Climate change has been in the past an important driver. Now we have an additional driver after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and countries' energy security concerns. And this led us to actually revise up our forecast, the largest ever revision, upward revision that we have done, about 30% globally, which is led by these 4 markets that you can see in the figure. China's new 14 5-year plan, which basically has important, ambitious renewable generation targets and market reforms, which is combined with cheap renewables that is driving our forecast revisions. In the European Union, an important acceleration is happening due to the energy security concerns. In the United States, unprecedented policy support by the Inflation Reduction Act, and India's ambitious target and the implementation improvements drive our forecast upwards. When we look at the deployment by country and region, we see basically China continuing to lead renewable capacity expansion in the next 5 years, accounting for almost half of every single renewable energy plant that will come online by 2027. This is an important acceleration compared to previous 5 years. When we look at Europe, we see a more than doubling of the growth during the forecast period. And this unprecedented growth is adding into a context of stable expansion over the last decade, which means that energy security really triggers in our forecast an incredible amount of additional capacity combined with ambitious climate targets that the European Union has. A similar situation in the United States. Policy certainty by the Inflation Reduction Act, for the first time, long-term extension of incentives for all renewables, including deployment and manufacturing, will lead into this incredible growth. India is a similar story. Basically, the solar PV growth in India is more than doubling the India's renewable expansion in the next 5 years. In other regions in the world, the growth is accelerating as well. There are various drivers, but an important driver is basically the competitiveness of renewables. In Brazil, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in all the other countries, cheap renewables are providing new capacity that is cheaper than existing system or new additions that will come up. So this also contributes to the diversification benefits of the countries. When we look at the global power system in the coming 5 years, we see an important change as well. As Dr. Birol mentioned, we expect solar PV to become the largest installed capacity in the world by 2027, surpassing gas the year before and coal in 2027. And by the way, also the wind growth almost doubles, surpassing the hydropower. So solar PV and wind basically is providing an important capacity to the global electricity markets, with renewables as a whole accounting for 90% of the expansion. There's always questions when we present capacity about what about generation? Are renewables generating more than coal or more than gas? And here is the answer. Actually, this growth that you see in terms of capacity will help renewables to surpass coal by early 2025 to become the largest source of electricity generation in the world. And as you can see, in 2027, renewables provide about 30% of the 40% of the global electricity generation, surpassing by far the coal and become the largest. Meanwhile, we expect the share of all the other fuels to decline and their share basically moving to the renewables. An important message that we released in July with the solar PV supply chain special report about highlighting the dependence on one single country for the 90% of the supply of solar PV. We expect this to change in the coming 5 years. There's an important movement, and as Dr. Birol mentioned, in two major economies, United States and India, concerning the investment in solar PV manufacturing to diversify supply. And we see an important tripling of the manufacturing investment in India and the United States, which is unprecedented actually in the history of these two countries, and which will make India the second largest home for solar PV manufacturing globally after China. But the question remains in terms of the supply of solar PV, because the largest market, China, will continue to invest in the coming years in solar PV manufacturing and will still remain the largest market. However, we see an important shift towards China's share in the global solar PV manufacturing for every single manufacturing segment, including those that are really critical concerning polysilicon and wafers. With the continuation of the measures that countries have today for the export and import of solar PV panels, we expect that China's share for critical segments can go down to 75%, and for other segments actually close to below 70% in certain cases. So it remains an important question about solar PV strategy. However, with all these investments, even in our most optimistic forecast, we expect a supply glut coming to the market for solar PV, actually doubling the need of the demand in the coming years. So there will be an important opportunity to merge several manufacturers in terms of their plants, or basically decommission the old capacity which has the oldest technology today. An important analysis that we conducted for the first time this year pertains to the renewable capacity dedicated to hydrogen production. There are a lot of countries introduced policies and support measures, actually in more than 25 countries plus the European Union, in order to deploy renewable-based hydrogen. And the forefront two technologies will be onshore wind and solar PV. And we expect today about 500 megawatts of solar PV and wind deployed for hydrogen production to increase to 50 gigawatts, which is a growth of 100-fold. This accounts for only 2% of the forecasted growth. However, it's an important start for a sector in the next 5 years to become sizable and becoming a new driver for solar PV and wind capacity growth. And there are two important motivations for this. On the one hand, we see China, Europe, United States investing in green hydrogen in order to use domestically to decarbonize transport and industry, which are among the largest markets. However, there is also other markets who are seeing an important opportunity to export hydrogen to the where demand will grow rapidly, such as in Europe, for instance, or in Asia. Australia, Middle East and North Africa and Chile provides this important opportunity and will invest in renewable-based hydrogen in the coming years. And actually, it will become an important driver. Up to 15 to 20% of their renewable growth will be dependent on green hydrogen. So it's renewable-based hydrogen is coming very strongly thanks to the policies and government plans. Quick look at the biofuels. For the first time this year, we did an analysis related to the feedstock of biofuels, which means that whether it's crops or wastes that are providing biofuels production. First of all, despite supply chain constraints, we see biofuels production to increase by over 20% in the coming years. And more importantly, the share of waste and residues will basically provide about 20% of the growth. And there are important fuels to mention here. Renewable diesel and biojet are important drivers of this growth in order to decarbonize long-haul transportation and aviation. And when we look at the trends driving this waste and residue-based biofuel production, we see two important markets in advanced economies such as US and Europe driving this growth with important carbon emission reduction policies. On the other hand, we see emerging economies continue to exploit their competitive crops, which is also providing an important stimulus to the rural economic development through agriculture. And we see an important driver here, and we expect that more and more waste will increase its share in the coming years, accounting for 1/3 of total growth. Just to finish with our last slide, as Dr. Birol mentioned, the growth is incredible, huge, and accelerating. However, there is more that can be done, and we analyze this in our accelerating case. And the most important three drivers of this growth is basically permitting wind and solar projects faster, addressing grid and system integration issues very rapidly, and enabling affordable financing in developing countries. And just to finish with the whether this growth is on track with the net zero goals. We see with the accelerated case, solar PV is actually becoming extremely close and in line, almost in line with the net zero ambitions of the world, which is a very good news. And with faster and more dedicated policies to wind and other renewables, we can see an important development closing the gap to net zero in the coming years. One last thing about our data. All the data that I presented here and even more will be available online, is today available online in a data tool. You can explore more than 100 countries, all renewable technologies, including electricity, heat, and transport, in our data tool, freely available online. And the entire report of 150 pages is also freely available for your view. Thank you very much, and I'm passing the floor to Jethro, Mr. Mullen.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Mr. Bahar and Dr. Birol. We now have time to take some questions from journalists. So we invite the journalists in attendance to send your requests through the Q&A function of the Zoom, if you haven't done so already. And please mention your media outlet along with your question. We'll just take a 2-minute break to give you a chance to submit those questions. We'll be right back. Hello, welcome back. Thank you very much to the journalists for the questions. We're going to go through as many of them as we can right now. The first one comes from Catherine Hours from Agence France Presse. Her question is, the report is showing progress. However, how far are we and how far will we be in 2027 from where we need to be to meet our global climate goals? I think Mr. Bahar is going to take this first question.
Thank you, Mr. Mullen. As I showed in my last slide, we are not there yet, but we are getting really close. I think the progress shows that with policies and with the new energy security drivers, renewables can accelerate even faster, which we show in our accelerated case. It still falls short of the ambition, global ambition of climate goals. But it's an incredible progress, especially for solar PV. And what we need is governments addressing important challenges for other technologies than solar PV. And this includes mainly the permitting measures that needs to be addressed in many countries, including advanced and emerging economies.
Thank you, Mr. Bahar. The next question is about Europe, and it's, can Europe really use renewables to replace Russian natural gas supplies? And there's also a question about from Camilla Nashert from S&P about potential barriers in the EU in terms of domestic solar PV manufacturing. I think perhaps Dr. Birol will take the one on gas supplies, and perhaps Dr. Bahar could speak a little bit about manufacturing. So Dr. Birol first.
With pleasure. We see renewables as a major option to reduce Europe's reliance on gas in general, Russian gas imports in particular. Of course, it cannot replace the entire Russian gas imports because, first of all, a bulk of the Russian gas imports are used for electricity generation, but also there is a significant part used for heating at home and also for industry sector. So for the electricity generation, yes, renewables, especially solar and wind, can be an excellent way to substitute Russian gas imports. And there's a big potential there. But if you ask me whether or not Europe makes the most out of this potential, my answer is not yet. Despite these big numbers, there are certain policies, concrete, pragmatic policies Europe has to put in place in the next months and maybe years to come. And as International Energy Agency said a few times, this winter is very hard because of the impact of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine on European energy sector. But next winter may well be harder. And it is the reason next week International Energy Agency will come up with a roadmap for European governments, what they need to do in order to address the next winter's big challenge of natural gas, to replace the Russian gas, what concrete policies they have to take, and the renewables will be an important part of the recommendations we are going to present European governments next week.
So for the manufacturing question, an important response is to remember how we get to here today. And the reason why China became the leader of solar PV manufacturing was an extensive policy support and actually an industrial policy over the last almost 2 decades consistently provided to this sector, as China chose this as a strategic sector for the future in 2000. And we are seeing this development in other parts of the region thanks to the policy support that is happening mainly right now concretely in India and United States. In the United States, Inflation Reduction Act provides an important incentive actually that is making renewables, solar PV manufacturing competitive with low-cost manufacturers in China and Southeast Asia. In India, the support that the government is providing is closing the gap by 80% with the low-cost producers and making an important leadway to scale up manufacturing to reduce costs.
Thank you, Dr. Bahar. And we've now got a question. We've actually got a couple of questions about the US Inflation Reduction Act and what it means for other regions. Would you expect, sorry, this question is from Georgia Grattan at Argus Media. Would you expect the US Inflation Reduction Act, given that it creates a very favorable environment for renewables developers, to push other jurisdictions to increase funding for renewables? I think Mr. Bahar will have a go at this.
Sure. So US Inflation Reduction Act, as we see today, in terms of both the push for new renewable capacity deployment, but also supporting every single segment of the manufacturing of the wind, PV, electrolyzers, batteries, electric vehicles, all the clean energy sector is an important encompassing policy that will help the investment to flow into the United States. I think the design of these policies and the way they are currently implemented and the announcements that we see from multiple companies, including American and worldwide, we see an important investment. So I think in terms of the policy design and the sectoral coverage, this could be repeated in other parts of the world, and other countries can also make a similar policy designs in order to support the industry. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. One more quick question, I think from Mr. Bahar about renewables is what from Mike Thatcher at Net Zero Investor. Why is solar more popular than, say, wind for renewables investment? Back to Bahar, Mr. Bahar.
Thanks, Mr. Mullen. The answer is actually a very important one to understand the challenges of wind sector. About half of our deployment in solar PV comes from smaller rooftop residential or commercial applications. These are driven by individuals. They are trying to save money on their electricity bills because solar PV is getting cheaper and cheaper. That's why those investments take very little time to complete, and it is important to mention that these are individual decisions and distributed widely around the world across user segments and geographies. When we come to the wind, the permitting timelines in many parts of the world is more than 5 years. In some countries it's 10 years. There are efforts to decrease these permitting timelines, but also social acceptance of wind is compared to solar is significantly lower, thus making those investments more complicated compared to the other solar PV technologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bahar. I think we've just got time for one last question, slightly broader than the scope of the report, but we'll take it. Dr. Birrell told The Guardian recently that people are wrong to say that the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is impossible. Can you elaborate a bit more about this, please? Dr. Birrell.
With pleasure. So yes, some scientists and some stubborn defenders of the existing energy system interestingly come together, converge their views, and claim that the 1.5 degree target is not anymore achievable. Now, we at the IEA look at the numbers very carefully, all energy data, all energy numbers, and we see that it is getting increasingly difficult to reach the 1.5 degree target, but it is far too early to write the obituary of the 1.5 degree target. Because we are seeing, as you have followed in this webinar, if you have time to read our renewable market report or the report we made on energy efficiency, or when you look at the numbers as far as the big growth of electrolyzers are showing, or the electric vehicle penetration. So a huge amount of money is pouring in clean energy. And as my colleague Mr. Bahar mentioned, the Inflation Reduction Act from United States, Repower EU in Europe, green transformation of Japan in Japan, China's new ambitions, India's big growth in renewables, they all mean that huge amount of money, cash money put on the table for clean energy investments. Our numbers show that currently, with the current policies, clean energy investments will be about $2 trillion in 2030. And if we want to reach the 1.5 degree target, be in line with this, we need to double that, close to $4 trillion. Is it easy? Not at all. Very difficult, especially if we note that the bulk of this money need to go to emerging and developing countries. It's a big challenge, but in our view, to say that a 1.5 degree target is dead is factually poor and politically irresponsible, as such a conclusion may even jeopardize to reach the target's 1.6, 1.7 degrees target. So as such, IEA will continue to push the clean energy transition as a solution to our energy security challenges, as well as having a better planet for all of us.
Thank you very much. So that's all we have time for. Lots of very good questions. Thank you very much for those. If any journalists have questions that didn't get answered during our Q&A that you'd like to follow up on, we invite you to reach out to our press office and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Thank you again to Dr. Birol, Mr. Bahar. Thank you to the journalists for your participation and the questions. And thank you to everyone who's following this event online around the world for your interest in our work. Just a reminder that the full Renewables 2022 market report and the accompanying Data Explorer are available for free on our website. So please do take a look if you have a chance. And that's all for today. Thank you very much.